Hello, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Let me start by introducing myself, as I will be your moderator for this evening. I am Jonathan Maas. I work as a journalist for the Dutch broadcaster VPRO. And I've been asked by the Holland Festival to introduce Professor Tu Weiming to you, which I'm very happy about, because I met Professor Tu Weiming 4 years ago when I did a project on artists and scientists and modern thinkers that had and have revolutionary ideas on how to change the world for the better. Professor Tu Weiming being one of them. In the interview back then, 4 years ago, we discussed on how the geopolitics were changing, and they still are, and on the power of upcoming markets and the role of Europe and China therein. And he was quite optimistic about this change, because he said that we, the West and Europe, could learn from humanism based on the Chinese Confucian tradition, which is what he's going to talk about tonight. Now, a lot has happened the last 4 years, and I'm curious to see if he's still as positive as he was 4 years ago. So, with great pleasure, I introduce Professor Tu Weiming.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that was not the entire quote. The entire quote was that China, for more than 170 years, even longer, been devoted student of Western learning, especially of the Enlightenment of the West. Of course, Holland is an important contributor to that tradition. So China will continue to learn. And in fact, I want to underscore the importance of China as a learning civilization ever since the impact of the West on China in the mid-19th century. So that's exactly what I prefaced my talk. But at the same time, I believe a kind of humanism that is emerging, which is also valuable as a source of reference, not only for China, which is absolutely critical, but also for the West. So my sense is this mutual learning is exactly what is needed. And mutual learning is not just restricted to the East and West, but it's North and South, and the global community as a whole. Many of us are critically aware of the fact that globalization, which normally was understood as the intensification of westernization and modernization. Now we use the term globalization. But in fact, it is not. It is much more complicated, because westernization and modernization sometimes suggested convergence, suggested a path that eventually all human beings will follow, and even suggested the idea of homogenization. Cultural differences will no longer be that important, because in the modernizing process, in this new world, we all share science and technology and the benefits of the Enlightenment. Therefore, there's no need for us to worry about division, about regionalism, about the various kinds of regional and local concerns. But obviously, in the last few decades, we realize globalization enhances regionalization and localization. It is not homogenization. The global world is noted for cultural diversity, religious pluralism, the emergence of many, many communities, and of course, there's a great deal of threat of conflict and tension. But in any case, there's no question about the fact that the modern world has been shaped by Westernization, began probably with Enlightenment of the 17th century, and continued shaped by this process. We look at market economy, democratic polity, civil society, and the dignity of the individual. We look at major infrastructure of the world, multinational corporations, great research universities, industrial complex, and the various kinds of international NGOs and organizations. We know the West, my colleague Sam Huntington talked about the West and the rest. The West was already in the rest for more than 100 years, not necessarily by invitation, but all over the world. Holland actually, for a while, colonized Taiwan. So there is a very important legacy in Taiwan about Holland. But of course, Indonesia, South Africa, and so forth. And in fact, Western learning began in Japan, in a small island outside of Nagasaki called the Dejima. In that small island, the learning was called Rangaku, which in translation is Dutch learning. And that Dutch learning began in that small island. Unfortunately, it was basically weaponry and technology, but also, of course, applied sciences as well. So Western learning has been overwhelming for the last few decades, ever since the mid-19th century. In China, in the mid-19th century, with the Opium War of 1839, went through a very difficult period of adjusting to this new wave of power from the West. And curiously, from 1939 to 1919, in that 70 years, every 10-year period, China changed dramatically. The collapse of the military defense, industrial infrastructure, social communities, government, the empire, Manchu Empire, which was considered as the center of civilization, declined, and eventually collapsed with the Japanese aggression. And not only that, the internal warlords were involved in internecine fighting. And then from 1919 to 1949, for that 30-year period, and with intensified Japanese aggression, that's part of the Second World War, and various kinds of revolutionary forces in trying to reassert their power in China. And China further declined and was reduced to basically a geographic expression, no longer existed as a unified nation. But the curious thing most of us are not aware is that even in the year 1839, when the Opium War began and China began to collapse, the Chinese economy was 17 to 20%, comparable to the power of the American economy in the world today. And there was a two-way trade between China and England, and it was totally in China's favor. England was interested in the Chinese silk, Chinese porcelain, China, and interested in tea, and even some kind of craftsmen and agricultural produce. China was not interested in anything from England at the time. So the trade was totally imbalanced. The legalization of opium was a measure which many of the British historians and statements regretted immensely, but that was the beginning of the flow of silver back to England. But the important thing to remember was that for 100 years, there had no communication between China and the West. And in that 100 years, that's late 18th, 19th century, that's the Industrial Revolution, that's the development of great institutions. There was a great economic power and urbanization and secularization. So for 100 years, the balance dramatically changed. And it changed for a long time, and we're still very much in that scenario. In other words, the West, the rise of the West, and actually totally dominated the world scene. And this situation began to change after the unification of China by the People's Republic of China in 1949. And yet, if you look at the 30 years in 1949, every 5 years, there was a major disaster. It was the Korean War. It was the economic disaster of the Great Leap Forward. And then starvation. According to one account, maybe as many as 30 million people died of starvation, a major tragedy in modern history. And then the Cultural Revolution, first part and the second part. And then China began to reform and open up to the market in 1979. But real economic development in China did not begin until 1994 in Shanghai. So what we're talking about, the Chinese economic power, it's a short history. It's a recent history. And I think with this understanding, I would not consider the rise of China simply as an economic issue. I want to look at China from my perspective as cultural China, as a cultural universe, including not only the People's Republic of China, but also areas like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and Singapore with 76% Chinese, but also Chinese diasporas or diasporic communities, Chinese in Holland, Chinese in France, or Chinese in America, in Southeast Asia, all of these areas. But I also want to include another group of people. They're connected with China neither by birth nor by marriage, but they're interested in China, like you, in some long-term perspective. They are also included. They are Japanese, Koreans, Dutch, French, Russian. They're also included as part of cultural China. And if we look at this phenomena, we should have a much broader vision of what we are really concerned about. And from this perspective, and it is quite interesting for the Chinese to understand Europe. And first of all, Europe symbolizes the Enlightenment and symbolizes advanced technology, science, and also symbolizes a great deal of power and influence, especially in the cultural arena. And so it is simply a fact that many Chinese intellectuals consider themselves basically students of Western learning. So to be a student, of course, not in a symbolic sense, but in a real sense, there are Chinese students all over Europe. United States, for the last few decades, began to emerge as an important major center for Chinese learning. And let me make a few very general impressionistic accounts. For the Chinese, with a population of 1.3 billion, and the population of Europe, by comparison, is not huge. And yet, it's so diverse and so complex. And ever since the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, this area remained separate, remained in competition. Of course, there was once the Holy Roman Empire, but it was not holy, it was not Roman, it was certainly not an empire. And only in recent years, with the effort of the European Union, that we see the attempt to come to terms with many different kinds of observations, many ethnic groups, many cultural backgrounds, to come together as Europe, with the memory of maybe Greece, Rome, and the medieval period. It's something difficult for China to imagine, because in China, the civilization continued for 2,000 or 3,000 years, not without interruption, but basically with a sense of continuity. And one thing that is obvious to most of us, but no one has done a good analysis, is the question of language. The written forms in Chinese, there are many, many written forms, different in ancient China, but became unified as early as the 3rd century BC. So ever since the 3rd century BC, the way to write Chinese with variations continued throughout centuries. The countries divided, so there are numerous languages in China. We call them dialects. You can speak Shanghainese, you speak Peking Mandarin, you speak any language. And the difference between a Fujian dialect and the Mandarin is even as great as the difference between English and Arabic. Very different dialects. But you speak different dialects, but if you want to write, you write Chinese character. It's the same thing. Imagine that High Latin in the 18th century, Newton and others wrote in High Latin. If High Latin persisted in Europe with the only way of writing, if you want to write, you always write in High Latin. You could speak German, speak Italian, speak French, speak any kind of dialects, but when you write High Latin. This is something like in China. You speak many different dialects, but when you write. That, for a while, that's also true with Japan, with Korea, and with Vietnam. So that's a very important contrast. Now I know that there are 27 members of the European Union, but there are more than 27 languages to be covered. And so the linguistic diversity, not to mention the ethnic diversity and cultural diversity, makes Europe particularly fascinating. And I would consider that can be an empowering force for the future, because the world is going to be more complexified, world going to be more diverse, and no single nation or single culture is going to dominate the world. The more we know different culture, different traditions, the more we're equipped to deal with the future. And that's also true with the whole question about in Europe and how you develop an inclusive society, not just excluding, inclusive society. But that's painfully difficult, partly because of cultural, religious, ethnic, not to mention economic, political conflicts. Now, in terms of religion, which is, I understand, an extremely sensitive topic, and in China, 3 major traditions evolved. One is Confucianism, which began in the 5th century BC, 6th century BC, but Confucius was a transmitter. He was not a founder of religion. You cannot imagine Buddhism without Buddha. You cannot imagine Christianity without Jesus Christ. You can imagine Confucianism without Confucius, because he didn't invent it, he didn't develop it, he only continued. And in fact, the term Confucianism is a misnomer. It's a term that we use in English. In Chinese, you cannot translate back into Chinese. The Chinese is simply the scholarly tradition, the ancient tradition, the venerable tradition. So Confucius was a part of a long tradition. So he's not the inventor of a tradition. Now, because he's not an inventor, he learned from many other traditions in order to develop his own philosophy. He learned from the Taoists. He learned from the Mohists. He learned from the legalists. He learned from yin-yang people and so forth. So how to learn from different traditions in order to formulate a broader vision of you became a very important challenge ever since the beginning of the Confucian tradition. Then Taoism also became a major force. Of course, in terms of intercivilizational dialogue, perhaps in human history, one of the most significant events was the introduction of Buddhism to China from India. And this introduction of Buddhism to China was not imposition from India. The Chinese devotees went to India to beg for this learning. And the teachers who came from India were greatly respected as national teachers. But they were very humble. They just didn't want to teach. They want to share their experience. They accept some disciples. Eventually, Buddhism became an integral part of Chinese culture. So we talk about the three great traditions in China: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, especially Sinicized Buddhism. And these three traditions coexisted without wars and conflicts for a long, long time. But now we need to talk about 5 religions, in addition to the 3 I mentioned: Islam and Christianity also. Christianity came to China in the Tang Dynasty, and Islam in the Mongol Dynasty. So there are 3 to 5 teachings coexisted. I visited an ancient city of the Ming Dynasty, maybe 14th century, and I was surprised to see a Taoist temple and a Taoist shrine and a Buddhist temple facing each other, which means those people who visited the Taoist temple probably will also visit the Buddhist temple. From not too far away, there was a Catholic church. The Catholicism also was introduced to China in probably 17th century. So in that small town with the 3 valleys, you could see the 3 temples there coexisting without really conflict and tension. In Europe, too, there's a powerful civil society. America probably has the most powerful civil society because society is more important than the state. But I think in Europe in general, the social forces from the Chinese point of view are very powerful. They challenge the state. Sometimes they are managed by the state, but they challenge the state. And they're demonstrated by incredible cultural organizations. Whenever we talk about Europe, we talk about great universities. We talk about great museums. We talk about great cities. We talk about the mass media. We talk about civic societies. We also talk about major centers, the city where all the cultural resources, opera, music, and ballet, all concentrated in one particular area. And you see then in Europe this cosmopolitanism, this regionalism, this nationalism, and this also localism. They coexist, sometimes in conflict and tension, sometimes complementary. A friend of mine who did his PhD with me from Denmark, he once made a remark, say, we Danish are not like Chinese. We don't have this burden of being a big power in the center of the universe, nationalism, chauvinistic culturalism. We don't have that at all. We are part of Europe. I consider myself not just Danish, but European. I'm cosmopolitan. Then 2 summers later, he came back. He said, oh, Professor Du, I have to apologize. I actually didn't take all the factors into consideration. Danish nationalism is real. You know, this summer, for the first time in our history, our soccer team beat German team and now became number 1. And the whole country celebrated this event for 3 days. So we're very nationalistic in that particular sense. Sure. But if you look from the Chinese point of view, the most powerful ideology in human history is the Enlightenment mentality of the modern West. And Europe is symbolized by this mentality. We know market economy, democratic polity, civil society, as already mentioned. But to me, much more important is the cherished values, core values, some people say universal values, that continue to inform how we should live the meaningful life for a long time to come. I think this is demonstrated in very various ways. What are these core values? One of them is certainly rationality, reason. And Max Weber even talked about modernization as rationalization, as secularization. And the importance of rationality, well, Descartes' important contribution of the thinking person, the mind, the rational way of looking at it. Then freedom, especially in America, but I think in France, the idea of freedom, even though freedom may lead to sometimes disastrous consequences, but that freedom is a cherished value that is absolutely critical. Then legality, due process of law. And of course, since 1949, 1948, even before, human rights. And if you want to find a sacred, kind of sacred universal values that are cherished by most Europeans, as human rights. And then also the dignity of the individual, a form of individualism, but it's not egoism, the dignity of individualism. But we also know that the Enlightenment, this modernizing process that fueled by the dynamism of Europe, has also negative consequences. One of the negative consequences is to regard knowledge as power. And not just rationality as reasonableness, as communicative rationality, but instrumental rationality. It's to use rationality as a way of not only controlling, understanding, but subduing, for example, nature. And freedom, especially if the freedom is connected with no restrictions, and the freedom may become licentious. And the due process of law can become litigious. This is especially now in America. In other words, all human relationships are being governed. Is there a dispute between parent and child? If there's dispute between spouses, and any form of dispute, you cannot afford not to have a lawyer to represent you. And that becomes very costly, but also becomes very destabilizing in terms of social harmony. And rights without responsibility may turn out to be a serious problem, even though the idea of human rights as the dignity of the individual is always cherished as a positive value. In fact, in 1948, when this whole idea has been developed, and one contributor to the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights was a Confucian scholar by the name of Zhang Pengchun. And Mrs. Roosevelt, she was the chair of that session, and in her diary mentioned again and again during that period of time how Mr. Zhang contributed to their discussion. For example, one very important decision was not to bring religion into the document. So there's no mention of God. And yet Zhang insisted there must be a sense of humanity. Therefore, finally, they use reason and conscience. Conscience actually is the term for a kind of humanity that Zhang Pengchun, as a Confucian, insists upon. Then the dignity of the individual, if it is not properly understood, can become a kind of possessive individualism. Possessive individualism turned out to be detrimental to any human community. So we can say in the history of the modern West, especially in the last half a century, there are quite a few very powerful intellectual forces that try to correct the negative consequences of the Enlightenment, that, as I pointed out, or of modernization. And earlier, in the 60s, that feminist movement, the quest for gender equality, but also the feminist movement put a lot of emphasis on the tender care, for example, nurturing. And the environmental movement also began in the 1970s with emphasis on care for the earth, concern for the earth. I know that Michel Foucault, to the end of his life, also put a great deal of emphasis on the idea of care for the self, the idea of care, rather than just rationality. But there are also environmentalists that began to correct very negative features of aggression towards nature. Nature was considered as a collection of objects rather than as part of our own human communion. And of course, the movements of communitarianism with emphasis on republicanism, and not to mention the movement of multiculturalism and religious pluralism. So we can say that the Enlightenment, the classical Enlightenment mentality needs to be further refined, the moral depth to be cultivated, and also needs to be broadened. The great values of rationality, freedom, due process of law, human rights, and dignity of the individual continue to be great values. But they are not enough. If we have all these and greatly develop them, it's basically fixing the relationship between two human beings, or a human being, human individual, and society. There are two very important, or at least three important dimensions are missing. One is ecological. How do we relate ourselves as a human community to nature? In the Enlightenment ethical resources, we do not have enough of that concern. The other one, actually, it's a spiritual quest. The Enlightenment began as anti-clerical, against religion, and developed human rationality. Yet, the spiritual side of the human, and no matter how you define it, sometimes it can be extremely explosive, detrimental. But the spiritual side of the human is unavoidable. That's why in the 21st century, I attended the Davos Global Forum. In the year 2000, the theme for this economic forum was the future of religion in the 21st century. In other words, these political economists became aware of the importance of religion either as a negative or as a positive force. It's important for us to be aware of that. That's second dimension. The third one is a sense of a global community. Of course, in the French Revolution, fraternity. Fraternity actually means universal love, or it means brotherhood. But that was not well developed in most important Western political thinkers. So we do have some very serious issues to concern with. What are some of these new values that will have to be incorporated, in addition to the one I mentioned? One is justice. And that's the reason why it has now become such an important issue in the political philosophy. But the one that I want to single out is sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And I realize that Adam Smith, the founder of economics, actually didn't consider himself an economist, because that term probably didn't even occur at the time. And he considered himself as a moral philosopher. And his most important book turns out to be a theory of moral sentiments. And in the theory of moral sentiments, he puts a great emphasis on sympathy. So the wealth of nation is not in conflict with the theory of moral sentiments. The wealth of nation, if we understand him correctly, is based upon some sympathetic feeling for your fellow human being. Otherwise, the invisible hand can turn out to be deadly. The invisible hand is not just to enhance power. Then, in addition to legality, the importance of civility. In addition to rights, the importance of responsibility. In addition to the idea of dignity of the individual, there's also social solidarity or social harmony. In other words, the celebration of life, the celebration of forces that will empower human beings to flourish as human beings, as an end in themselves, each and every human being to flourish. And this sense of learning to be human is something that is critically important for our present situation. Are there still universal values that bring humanity together? More essential, I suppose, is the question, is humanity itself a universal value that can evoke a sense of togetherness in the global community? The Chinese word for humanity here is ren, which also been rendered as benevolence, as human-heartedness, or simply humanity. Various significant attempts have been made to revitalize humanism as an underlying concern for reconfiguring a world order that human beings can live together in an inclusive society. This is not just from the UN, but this I circulated a very short note that I delivered at so-called summit, a conscience summit in Paris in preparation for the ecological meeting. And UNESCO and many other social organizations, especially interreligious ones, all talk about this. The deliberate effort to transcend simply abstract universalism. This is not abstraction. This is concrete. This is a feeling which you can sense with your heart and mind, even with your body. This idea of common destiny or common fate is not disguised as a strategy of domination when we talk about the importance of harmony. the recognition of cultural diversity features prominently in humanistic thinking today. First, we recognize the difference, recognize the other, recognize even radical otherness. Many humanists consider difference as a precondition for harmony. Harmony without uniformity, or more positively, harmony that tolerates, recognizes, and respects difference is the right path. Whereas the demand for conformity is a kind of ideologized pattern of control. It's a distorted version of harmony. So harmony is not sameness, is not conformity. Harmony, precondition for harmony is recognition of difference. Globalization is arguably a more intensified process of modernization, but in a deeper sense, it is also a profoundly significant departure from modernization. The spatial idea of the West and the temporal idea of the modern both imply a developmental strategy that leads to convergence and eventually to homogenization. But I think in our globalized world, since it enhances localization, nationalization, and regionalization, it enables us to see a whole spectrum of color, sound, smell, taste, mood, emotion, and sentiment associated with ethnicity, with gender, with language, with age group, with place, with class, different social strategy, and also faith. That's religious. Human community has never been so differentiated, and at the same time, due to advances in science and technology, especially information and communication technologies, has never been so interconnected. How do we envision harmony in diversity in a differentiated and interconnected community? This is the reason I use the term spiritual humanism. But humanity is differentiated from and simultaneously interconnected with all modalities of being in the universe. If you believe the story of the Big Bang, probably 1.8 billion light years ago, the galaxy, the sun, the solar system, the earth, and everything grew out of that long and strenuous process. And that involves the emergence of the sun and the earth. So in the planetary scale, the emergence of life, animals, and the human species is also an integral part of the same narrative. And so when the Chinese said, "Heaven and earth are my parents," it is not a romantic assertion, but an empirical statement. And in this sense, an important feature of spiritual humanism is the sanctity of the earth, sacredness of the earth. I think for quite a while, Vatican resisted the idea, but I think the current Pope is sympathetic to that idea. You should respect Earth as a sacred being. The critical issue is to recognize that it has taken billions of years with very fine tuning of all the elements of air, water, soil, and numerous other factors for us, to emerge, but of course for a very brief moment. We can dismiss the whole story as pointless. We can follow major and minor creation stories to accept the thesis that there is purpose in our existence. So I accept some arguments by scholars, philosophers in particular, that it cannot be empirically proved. It is not science in a strict sense. It's faith. The faith is we do believe that there is a purpose in human life. We do believe that Earth is meaningful. It's a faith in believing the Earth is meaningful, human life is worthwhile, is of profound significance. However, some people who believe that are also secularists and saying that we have to get rid of religions. We have to get rid of especially the monotheistic religions. And there's a hope that physicists and astronomers eventually will answer the ultimate question when they discover the theory of everything. In other words, we believe that there's life, or there's meaning in life, there's meaning in human existence, there's a meaning of the earth. But we don't believe in any kind of theology. My position is a bit different. I have to explain why. Now, if we know we live in a very strange universe, atoms, all the atoms, make up only 4% of the visible universe. Dark matter makes up about 24%. And dark energy, which means the energy associated with the empty space, makes up 72%. It is reasonable to assume that there is always mystery beyond human rationality. The more we know, we ought to know, we must know, and yet we do not know. The more the enlightening of rationality extends, the more the vague of ignorance extends further. The more we know, the more we are aware of the mystery of the universe. This does not necessarily mean creation ex nihilo. It doesn't mean that. But the grammar of theism, I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Buddhist, but these traditions strike a very sympathetic resonance in my idea about spiritual humanism. Because sacred places, such as the cathedral, church, temple, mosque, synagogue, hymns, songs, prayers, dances, festivals, are beyond the pretensions to scientific and philosophical or theological control. We can think rationally and ignoring all these as superstitious, as something which is not real, which is simply humanly imagined. But that's fine. We have the privilege to do that. But from my point of view, all three great theistic religions have spiritual resources and intellectual depths to inspire us to sing songs of hope and express our gratitude to divine love. They have made profound contribution to human religiosity. But not just the three theistic traditions. Atheistic, pantheistic, indigenous forms of religions like Shinto, all these traditions have a place. Have a place in the sense that they are not part of the wholly other, totally different. They are part of the lived human world, here and now. So we can regard the secular world here and now as sacred. In other words, the life world is itself intrinsically meaningful. It is where the ultimate meaning of life is realizable and ought to be realized. Our ordinary human existence itself evokes a sense of respect. I think in China, one of the major problems is that people have lost faith in anything except the purchasing power. And that sense of meaninglessness with no sense of reverence and so forth is very much at odds with the Confucian tradition that I'm trying to present here. We learn to be fully human through earth, through community, and through our body. Our body is not something we earn, not something we own. I do not own my body. I am my body. The body is an attainment. As toddlers learn gradually to use the hands, use the feet regularly. And so the body growing old, going mature, going decaying, that whole process is implied in my self-development. The spiritual transformation is not a departure from where we are, but a journey to the interiority of our being. The innermost core of our being, the source of our self-knowledge, is none other than the macrocosmic reality ingrained in our existence. Nothing is lost. The whole process is embedded in the human world today. Earth community and body, of course, constrain us. They shape us, but they shape us into concrete forms. We are inescapably earthly, communal, and bodily. Hitherto, spiritual traditions in general have instructed us to free ourselves from these constraints, from the constraint of the earth, from the constraint of our own community, society, especially from the constraints of our body. A great human aspiration is to be liberated from the mundane bondage, to escape from the prison house of the soul. But in spiritual humanism, these are not constraints. These are enabling constraints. Because these constraints, we become fully human. Earth is our home. Community is our home. And our own body is the home for our soul, for our own spirit. They are instrumental in offering each of us the unique path for self-realization. Without them, we cannot exist in any concrete sense. They are, in a way, our incarnations. Each one of us is incarnated in our body, in earth, and also in our community. So, a human being that is conceived in this way is not a creature, but an active agent in the cosmic transformation as an observer, as a participant, and indeed, I may use the expression, as a co-creator. There's a partnership between heaven and human. Even though they may not be, the world may not be created by a creator, ex nihilo. The creativity of the world since the Big Bang has never been lost, but accumulated in every segment of the evolutionary story, in the story of the sun, earth, life, animal, and human. We are the inheritor of the cosmic energy. We are charged with the responsibility to see to it that what has been endowed in our nature continue to give generative power to new realities and life forms. So this humanism believes that human life has transcendent meaning. It's not just mundane. That there's always mystery to be comprehended. That theism, as well as other manifestations of human religiosity, teach us to rise above simply secularization. We are finite beings, but in our finitude, there is the constant presence of infinite divinity. So, spiritual humanism is a faith in humanity. The task of learning to be fully human is to form one body with heaven, earth, and a myriad things. For there's an intrinsic unity between the world here, like immanent, and the transcendent. Let me conclude with a very short statement. There are 4 dimensions to this thinking. Each one of them is essential. You cannot miss any one of them and get the full story. The 4 dimensions are self, community, earth, and heaven. You can even have a diagram, heaven, earth, self, community, with the middle, humanity. And this diagram indicates that conceptualization, cultivation of the self, self-cultivation, cultivation of self, we do that every day, as a whole, it's a holistic process and a relational process. It's a spiritual exercise for human self-realization, which involves the wholeness of the body, the sensitivity of the mind, the purity of the soul, and the expansiveness of the spirit. And within us, we are not only physical, but mental and spiritual. The second dimension about nature is the harmonization of the community, which entails not only the unit that in which we are nourished, that's our family, but the community, the society, the state, and even the world. So the idea of community extends from the self to family to the human community and beyond, the community of the living or to the cosmos. The third one is a sustainable and harmonious relationship between the human species and nature. And sustainability actually means that. How can nature continue to be friendly? Because we relied upon nature for our existence, especially for the existence of numerous generations to come. And the African proverb is very beautiful. It says, the earth is not a gift from your ancestors. It is an obligation or promise for numerous future generations. So it's not something we own. It's something we need to take care of, not only for our own generation, but for generations to come. And therefore, there's a mutual responsiveness between heaven and humanity. Heaven and humanity are in partnership. And that's why I have one quote in the handout, and one of my favorite quotes, that heaven is my father and earth is my mother. Even such a seemingly insignificant creature as I finds a niche in their midst. All that fills the universe is my body. And all that directs the universe is my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So I'm related to all people in a differentiated way, not in the same way. Not universal love in the abstract, but in the concrete meeting of people through dialogue. But I extend my feeling of intimacy outward from my family to neighborhood to local community to nation and the world. I find myself connected by a common bond. Likewise, I'm related in differentiated way to members of the animal kingdom, to the life world, and the inanimate universe. But I am connected with all modalities being by a sense of consanguinity. We're all an integral part of this creative process. Now, I'm a human being not by choice. Even though I choose to be a Christian, to be a Buddhist, to be a Muslim, or to be Hindu, I'm critically aware that I'm a human being among other human beings. As a concrete and living human being here and now, care for the earth as my proper home is dictated by my common sense as well as by my faith in the survivability of the human species. So in this sense, I have faith in the meaning of being human. I have faith in the generative power of nature. And I have faith that there's not only a future for our children's children, but there will be continuous presence of Earth as our companion. So ever since the Axial Age, roughly speaking, 6th century BC, with leaders like Confucius, Socrates, Buddha, Christ, and Muhammad, taught humanity to be informed, knowledgeable, wise, and spiritual. There are different paths towards human flourishing. Cultural diversity, religious pluralism, and multiple forms of modernity will continue to characterize the ideological landscape of the human community. Yet, care for the earth, our true home, underlies all diverse, pluralistic, and multiple modes of human development. So in this new age, all believers, whether believing Christianity, believing in Islam, Buddhism, will have to develop, in addition to your own faith, a language of human flourishing, which is the language of global citizenship. And this is the minimum condition for us to rethink how human beings can eventually get together. Thank you.
Take this away. You take a seat. Thank you, Professor Tu. We're going to sit down in a minute, and because I'm sure there's some questions in the audience, and they can ask the questions, and we're going to discuss it. But I have a few questions myself.
Sure.
I'm glad you still keep the faith. You're still as hopeful as you were 4 years ago. Thanks. You state in your talk that Western values from the Enlightenment, humanism as we know it so far, should and could be enriched by Confucian values, such as empathy and sympathy and compassion. How would you say could these values be of any help tackling the problems that Europe is facing right now? You mentioned a few, globalization, nationalism. Can you elaborate on that, please?
I don't know whether probably you can elaborate better. We're worried, I think, from the point of view of the European Union, that with the departure of, with the exit of Britain, who knows? And it's a challenge. And we're deeply worried about, especially in finance, economic sector, because with the modern technology, and you can make billions in a few seconds, but you can also lose billions in a few seconds. And it's very unstable. And no government can have any control over these kind of situations. And also worry about migration. And I can mention that in China, one kind of migration is probably over 200 million people move from the countryside to the cities to gain jobs, to improve their livelihood. And so that internal migration in terms of volume is huge. And of course, the rise of China is often characterized by a sense of economic power, especially GDP. And yet, in terms of per capita, and you look at Europe as the first world, it's very, very affluent, beyond imagination, because there's still 200 million people below the poverty line, even though 600 million over the last 10 years or so became uplifted beyond. So the sense of vulnerability in China is very, very strong. And the rise of China indicates the rise of India with now 13% GDP, and even Indonesia, Turkey, Iran, and so forth. So the world has become, in terms of competitiveness, becomes more and more complicated. The question then, we have to return to the person. We cannot rely upon simply institution structures to allow us to live a peaceful life. We have to return to human self-questioning, return to the question of self-knowledge. And if we return to the question of self-knowledge, and one critical issue is precisely what does it mean by being human? How can we learn to be human? You know, the 2018 World Congress of Philosophy will be held in Beijing. And finally, the Congress decided the topic is learning to be human. And we know we are all human beings, but learning to be human, because this is a new way. And now, from my limited perspective, this learning to be human will have to begin with the question of the self. We have to find a niche for each one of us, learning for the sake of the self. But the self never as a center, never as an isolated individual, but always as a center of relationships. So then we have to think about the self in terms of the other.
But you stated in your talk that our current idea of what is human or humanistic point of view is limited, that it should be refined and it should be enriched by Confucian values, such as empathy and compassion. How could the world benefit from that right now?
Right. That's the reason why I think whether you call it spiritual humanism or not, each one of us will have to take into consideration of these 4 dimensions of being human. The question of the self, question of community, the question of the earth, the question of heaven. And in the sense that I ask myself, if I live in the first world, let's say live in the United States, if we look into the future, what will happen, say 50 years from now, if we're going to have any kind of peaceful transformation? Our lifestyle will have to change. There's no way that the lifestyle that enjoyed by every average American is sustainable.
Can you give an example of that? What particular lifestyle?
Well,
is that of America dominating the world and exploiting?
That's the American dream, right?
Which is becoming the Chinese dream as well, right?
No, it's everybody's dream. In other words, the big problem with China now, let's leave all the other questions aside about earning automobile. This is a kind of trade between pollution and development. And so far, it's totally weighted against the environmental protection. So growth means GDP growth. But in 2013, China changed because the pollution and not just the air pollution, but the water, soil, food, and so forth. Once that changed, the possibility of the Paris Accord was there. In Copenhagen, just 2 or 3 years ago, the Chinese position was extremely self-centered. In other words, they're not interested in any kind of bargain unless the America pay more. But now they know, well, you may ask America to pay more, but your pollution will make you unsurvivable. So you have to do that. I think Holland will have to think through many of these issues. I think especially the public intellectuals. We have to think through these kind of issues. Holland is one of the more liberal and open and pluralistic, tolerant. And yet, once the question of migration, when the question of ethnicity is involved, how are we going to deal with that? You know, one very common sentiment is, let's get rid of all these religious bigotry. Let's get off religions. And they caused us a lot of problems. And yet, in the 21st century, we realize how powerful these negative forces, not to mention these positive forces, religion turned out to be.
You mentioned in your talk that complexity and diversity as a good thing, as a positive thing,
right?
Where most Europeans right now see it as a source of constant tension and conflict. Mm-hmm. How could Europe be a harmonious continent with being still diverse and complex? Mm-hmm. And what role could Confucian values play in that?
I think globalization is a complexification, unlike modernization, which at the time people believe is homogenization. So complexification itself does not necessarily lead to conflict. The more differentiated, the more complex the system is, it's an organic solidarity rather than simply mechanic solidarity. If we reduce complexity to simple uniformity, and that would breed incredible havoc. I think in the last century, the two world wars told us the kind of collectivism, the kind of dictatorship could do incredible harm. So to recognize difference, to respect difference, and to see complexity, I don't think the other is necessarily always a threat. Even radical otherness, I think Clifford Geertz has pointed out, may turn out to be a liberating experience. We're going to see, let me give you one example. I can claim him as a good friend. He was the Dutch Prime Minister for 12 years, Mr. Lupus. He told me his own story when he grew up in the Catholic environment. And only when he turned 17 did he meet someone, a high school classmate, who's not a Catholic, who's a Protestant. So he said, that world is not just simple. The world was a beautiful world. But there's no way we can even imagine the possibility of anything of this nature. So you're going to encounter differences almost constantly. So how do we negotiate? It's a dynamic process rather than a static structure. And how do we negotiate with that? And how do we negotiate with, for example, many people say, how do we negotiate with the terrorists? You cannot negotiate with terrorists, but you have to be aware of the deep roots of this kind of terrorism, especially the Florida one. Someone who never grew up in that environment, grew up in America, and through the internet could be totally brainwashed and develop a sense of hate that was so intense that he would like to blow up the world. So I think the problem we face today is no longer simply a problem of institutions and so forth. It's really the mindset, how we consider its proper way to behave humanly. And I think it's not a tradition that can teach another tradition. I don't think so. What I'm talking now is not what Confucianism can contribute to the West. I've lost interest in that problem. Why? Because Confucianism has problem of its own immense problem. And how to revitalize in the cultural context of China is already incredibly difficult. And yet, the kind of spiritual humanism I'm advocating, based upon my own learning, is that it can serve as a reference for real emergence of, I would call it a dialogical civilization. It's not dialogue among civilizations, but through dialogue among civilizations, the kind of human communication becomes dialogical.
Because that's also the change in the world dynamics that you see, right? That it's
absolutely.
This century is not going to be a century of one superpower,
no.
Or China being the new superpower over
China,
America.
yeah.
It's going to be a lot of powerful countries that have to be in dialogue and have to work together to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've actually organized a series of discussions on dialogue on core values between the United States and China. What we cherish as freedom, we cherish as obligation. How do we begin? Without that kind of dialogue as a background, all the meetings turn out to be bargain, negotiation, and a shouting match. Certainly not dialogue.
You said we need a shifting mindset. We're here at the Arts Festival.
Yes.
What role could the arts play in that?
Oh, incredible.
Tell me.
Incredible. I think one thing we know, human beings are not just observers, but participants. And one of the absolutely necessary component of being human is an aesthetic sense of being a part of a much larger world. The quest for excellence. And the fierce competition, I think, let's say in the music world, turn out to be salvific, turn out to be salvational, because the better player you become, the better instrument or the instrumental music that will be delivered. The idea of the festival itself is a celebration of life, celebration of diversity, celebration of all kinds of dialogical encounters in a deep sense, not to convert.
But can it also help in shaping people's mindsets?
Absolutely, absolutely. I was exposed to Handel's Creation, and that to me is just incredibly powerful.
How did it change you?
I have more respect for spiritual music. I may not necessarily subscribe to a particular doctrine, but the music itself, the audio vision itself, is liberating. It's mind-opening.
Are there any questions here in the audience for Professor Tu?
My question is that I get a sense of optimism in your talk, and spiritual humanism is wonderful, but the human inability to ascribe to these values is also apparent. So I was wondering, why do you appear to be so optimistic, or do I misunderstand you?
You may sense an optimism, but it is struggle, a very painful struggle for quite some time. I think one of the most tragic scenarios we can think, especially in reference to the Earth, is that as science and technology and all these advances continue to become refined, we as human beings are critically aware what need to be done before we can get into this irreversible path of self-destruction. And yet we become aware the possibility of making any kind of change, especially of the fundamental kind that would be able to help us, is we become incapacitated. So the more we are aware of what we need to do, the more we become incapacitated. In a way, if you listen to my talk, that's Sai as well. That Sai is to say, it's obviously that something has to be changed. And obviously there's something that you can see and you recognize it. And yet, obviously, that is not the message that we received over the internet and over the world. And I think the question is, well, one optimism, I would say, is hope. It's not optimism, it's hope. St. Paul talk about faith, hope, and love. The most important is love. But hope is also part of that. If we have some great scientists who believe that the evolutionary story tells us so insignificant human beings are as a species, because our existence is a fraction of a billion moment. We will be gone. Looking at that possibility. But that may also be the reason why we feel inspired and feel obligated to realize ourselves as human beings.
How you define globalization made me very curious. You say globalization is more complex. I don't exactly remember the words. But what I see when people get more information and more a global view, that in general, what I see is that people tend to more bind together with like-minded people and shut themselves off because it is also complicated. And you seem to have a different view, that it all becomes like one society.
I think I agree with you. I agree with you that unlike modernization, which may at a time may lead to some kind of homogenization, globalization is complexification. If that complexification involves various kinds of, the emergence of various kinds of elite groups, and they organize themselves for the benefit of their own group, and the world becomes even more divided. You look at China, the Gini coefficient, it's probably worse than the United States now. So if you look at China, what is happening is the super rich, the billionaires, super rich, very small minority, but a very significant group of well-to-do, and they can send their children to primary schools or high schools abroad. And they have their own life, somewhat totally ordered according to their own design. And then you have an emerging middle class, which is struggling to maintain a very basic livelihood. Then you have huge group still of a poverty-stricken environment. So globalization means the world becomes even more divided, more fragmented, but at the same time, don't undermine the science and technology, especially in terms of the communication and information technologies. The younger you are, the more you are globally connected. And we know, I'm not simply saying in a romantic sense, the younger people are much more sensitive to to the protection of the earth. They're green. They're more cosmopolitan. They're not just being constrained in one exclusive society. And yet, precisely because of this, we have a new situation. The new situation is that a tiny group of people can do a great benefit from the whole world. They can also create havoc for the world. Even one person, a loner, can be extremely dangerous. This is a new situation we're in. And I understand that, I don't know the figure, many years ago, someone already told me that in 1976, the personal computer can process information comparable to the Pentagon as a whole. That's a personal computer. But now we have this little gadget. And the power is incredible. Each and every human being is being empowered. So now you look at China, right, the situation is highly differentiated, very few people are powerful. But the netizen, we call them netizen, the people who use the net. And this is so widespread that new ideas and new ways, of course now new ideas, basically new ways of getting rich, become very, very popular. But I think the situation is the increase of awareness also allows the fragmented, separate world to develop a global consciousness which is unified. And one of the unifying powers for this global consciousness is our attitude towards the earth as a whole.
In relation to that last question, because I remember you mentioned 4 years ago, you mentioned you have a son yourself, and you mentioned that he is on Facebook and how he's communicating with like-minded souls on Facebook where he doesn't know, for example, his neighbor or the person sitting next to him. Are you really positive that, because you mentioned this generation is more cosmopolitan as a whole, do you really believe that?
Okay, I stand corrected because you are working in the mass media and you are quite aware of all these problems. It is true in this new situation when a distant foreigner can become a close friend overnight, and you can totally ignore your colleagues or even your relatives. You can see now virtual reality sometimes becomes even more important than reality. And my virtual reality is with my instrument, and I have the communication and continues to do that. Now, three things that help civilization to continue are now being threatened. One is the art of listening. Right now, with the gadgets and so forth, it's difficult to listen, especially deep listening. The second one is face-to-face dialogue, like what we do. This is increasingly difficult for including younger people. The third one is the wisdom of the elders. In other words, not just data, information, but wisdom and even spirituality. So the phenomena you describe is familiar to me because I mentioned this to you in terms of my family situation. And yet, precisely because this constrains, people become more, people cherish more of the art, of the cultivating of the art of listening, of real genuine dialogue, and real listening to the cumulative wisdom of the elders. So I think these things are all going on almost simultaneously. And I think we, each one of us, especially those people in the public domain, can affect the whole situation in a way beyond imagination before.
More questions over here.
Professor Tu, thank you very much. I just want a small question. When you said about spiritual humanism, do you incorporate Marxist humanism as well? When 1949, when dialectic materialism become more prominent and humanism a bit a bit discarded, but you spiritual humanism does that incorporate Marxist humanism? Is there in there?
The question is whether I see any compatibility between humanism and Marxism. Normally, we talk about Marxism and Leninism and Maoism. We talk about the young Marx and the old Marx. Now, the young Marx is very humanistic, so it's compatible with the young Marx. But it's not compatible with not just the Lenin's idea of control, but also statism, the power of the state over the individual. Not at all compatible.
Hi, I have a question regarding the meaning of life. You insist that life has meaning, and your argument in favor of that proposition is that the more you know, the more you realize you do not know stuff. That in itself is true, I believe, but it does not point to meaningfulness or to meaning. It only points to a fantastic ignorance of people, that they don't know stuff. Not that there is a given meaning in life. And I say this because I find the flip side of meaning or faith, which you have spoken about much, the flip side, the drawback of faith is that, as you can find in any religion, a ban to think for yourself, any religion or any political system that requires faith or requires you to submit to that system because you need to believe in it, also requires you not to think for yourself. So my comment is that probably not a meaning in life, and there's no meaning in life, and maybe to enhance faith that much should not be very wise.
That was a comment, not a question. Okay. There's a question over there.
Actually, I changed already my question. I wanted to ask first about the individual towards the family, because Confucianism has a strong accent on family. And you were talking about individual being the center of relations. But then you started to talk about deep listening. And I'm a sound artist, so I changed my question. And I want to ask you about deep listening. You said that's the first thing that is ... I don't know what. I want to know what you mean with deep listening in ameliorating the human interaction. I suppose that you were pointing on that. Mm-hmm. Do you understand my question? Or
I think I understand. A professor by the name of Jaeger, a professor by the name of Jaeger, has made a distinction between the Greek civilization and Judaic. And he thinks the Greek civilization is very visual. You have the symmetry, you have balance, you have geometry, and whereas the Judaic one is very audio. In the sense, God never reveals himself in images. That's idolatry. I think in the Chinese case, the ear, because it's listening is temporal, as visual often is spatial. Now, you cannot listen well if your heart is not quiet, your heart is not tranquil. Because the temporal process requires the patience of waiting for the last note to be finished, even a voice. And so, don't listen with your ear. This is a statement in the Taoist. Don't listen with your ear, but listen with your heart. Don't just listen with your heart, but listen with your spirit. Which means that there's a precondition for deep listening. The precondition is your own mindset. And Confucius said, at the age of 60, my ears became obedient. Meaning that at the age of 60, he could allow all kinds of noises to go through him without any kind of prejudgment. Normally, we are very impatient. I think right now the young people are very impatient. And they listen and they judge, they reject. And the ability to allow the sound, which is temporal, entering into your body, which requires certain kind of self-discipline, even spiritual exercise.
Listening with your spirit, that seems like a good advice for an art festival. Are there more questions?
Hello. How are your ideas perceived in China?
Sorry, between China and?
No, sorry. How are your ideas perceived in China?
How are your ideas perceived in China?
I wish I know.
Yes, you do.
Let me say, I made it very clear that I'm talking about cultural China, which is much larger universe than simply People's Republic of China. And even in the People's Republic of China, they are liberal-minded intellectuals. They are very conservative. They are Confucians who rejected the West totally. They are Confucians who advocate the importance of continue to learn from the West. So it's a mixed bag. And I think the time, right now, my worry is that the Confucian tradition can be co-opted to become a justification for a certain form of nationalism. Therefore, how it's possible to deliver the message that the people will appreciate its deep-rootedness in its own culture, but cannot or should not be used simply as a justification for certain nationalistic purpose. And right now, because of the rise of China, there's a very strong sense of a new Chinese identity. And I hope this new identity is open rather than closed. It's pluralistic rather than monolithic. It's self-reflexive rather than self-absorbing. So this is how I would like my message to be heard, but this is totally beyond me.
In your answer, I was thinking, is actually any current form of government, even in the West, at this moment suitable for spiritual humanism you're advocating? Because I think it's as incompatible as in Europe or in America as it is in China at this point.
Do you see in Europe any examples of governments that is applying these humanism based on Confucian traditions?
Oh, it's a
sort of your question.
What I presented is a vision that needs to be critiqued, also needs to be understood. And the purpose of presenting it, it's not that it will be used or abused by some kind of authority. I think we have our own voice, try to articulate a position which, from my point of view, is a personal appreciation of some of the underlying thesis of this tradition. So it is not the purpose to find how useful this is. Now, if you ask the question, in any way can this be applied in any society, right? That's your question. I think it is being applied virtually in all societies in order to, in terms of the minimum requirement, in all societies. African societies, not to mention European and American societies. The question of the self, the question of community, the question of earth, the question of heaven. Each society uses it in different ways, not necessarily shaped by one particular doctrine. In other words, these four dimensions are inseparable. They need to be considered. So what I'm suggesting is not there's something ready-made that can be used or abused by any authority. That's not my duty at all, not my purpose. My purpose is to argue that in facing the human condition now, if we focus our attention simply on the question of a person and isolated individual and community, without any reference to nature or to heaven, that's incomplete. That cannot be sustained. And it has to be rephrased in such a way. So it is, it's difficult for me to imagine a situation in which learning to be human becomes no longer relevant.
And it's never finished, right?
Pardon me?
And it's never finished. It's an ongoing process.
I think it's both in terms of not just individual, but I think learning organizations. We talk about learning nations, and learning civilizations. So it's a dynamic process rather than a static structure. A person can either be understood as a self, as a substance of some kind, as a static structure. But a person is always a dynamic process, always in transformation. There's always self-reflection, and at the same time, it's always challenges from the outside. And this is a continuous process. And I don't think it can be frozen, like an island. It is a flowing stream that continues. Without the flowing stream, then the purpose becomes no longer functioning.
We want to thank you for learning us tonight, and we are going to go with the flow. Thank you again, Professor Tu.
Yeah.
And thank you all for coming. I think it's time to have a drink and face the rain.
So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Get a cuff.
Zit er ook een paraplu in de package?
Ja, nee, we zijn...